And we're live for episode 163 of Trek Live. How you doing this morning, Dan?
Doing great. Excited about this topic. Wanting to wish everybody a happy Easter if they
Happy Easter. Yeah.
if they celebrate it. If they don't, happy Sunday. Excited to talk about some Trek. Yeah.
Me too. Yeah. Hearing myself. Apologies.
Okay. This morning we're going to talk about first officers or captain and first officer dynamics. Bill and I kind of talked about this off air. And I think there's going to be a good conversation there, but I think before we jump into it, we should probably jump into our rewatch recap. So, Bill, how's the rewatch going?
Yeah, mine's rolling along pretty well. Last week when we did this, I was rewatching Discovery, which I did. I did the whole thing, all the way through season 3. So I wrapped that up since the last time we streamed. And for the more traditional Voyager Deep Space Nine alternating rewatch 3.0, I'm at what did I watch yesterday? The last ones I watched were State of Flux from Voyager and Distant Voices from Deep Space Nine. So I'm like 3/4 of the way through both of those seasons. I'm getting close to wrapping those up. Season 1 of Voyager, I think, starts stronger than I usually remember it. It's got a mix. I don't know. It's got a mix.
It's got a mixed bag, I think, at the beginning.
It's a mixed bag. Yeah, there are some episodes that are definitely misfires for me, but I guess it's been such a long time since I really properly watched Voyager. I'm just happy to be back in that world.
Gotcha.
And I'm enjoying it, even when the episodes aren't necessarily landing. But I really like Phage. I really enjoy Eye of the Needle from the first season. I think that's a heartbreaker. Really works well. Prime Factors, State of Flux. I think that's a good little run there. They're both pretty good. Prime Factors is we talk a lot about episodes that capitalize on the show's premise, and I think early on in Voyager, Prime Factors is such kind of Prime Factors and the Eye of the Needle are both roller coaster ride, like heartbreaking kinds of near, almost there kind of things. Like it's not going to come easy. Like the classic Star Trek solutions that the other shows would find to get out of problems aren't going to happen quite so. Aren't going to come easy in this premise. And I really like both those episodes for that reason. It establishes that it's going to be a long journey. It's going to be tough. There are going to be setbacks. Things aren't going to go as planned.
Yeah.
I love in Prime Factors the conversation Janeway has in the briefing room about this is what it must feel like on the other foot. Like when we deny sharing technology with the Kazon, for example.
Yeah.
Now we're feeling what the Kazon feel when we're told no. I love that. I love being put on the other side of the you're not ready for this, or we choose not to share kind of situation. And then with Deep Space Nine, that's oh god, I'm sorry.
You get some of that in Enterprise, but at this time when you're watching Voyager, we don't really get that. The previous shows were the most advanced, were the big hit on the block, but it's nice, it's refreshing from what I remember.
Yeah, definitely. And then real quick with episodes that don't work as well for me at this point in the show, like first 3/4 of season 1, I think Ex Post Facto has a really cool premise. We talked about it a little bit last week, I think, because you had watched Hard Time, and we talked about those two episodes kind of being similar with the alternate forms of extreme punishment, not just incarcerating you or not killing, not capital punishment, but finding ways to tackle these problems. And Ex Post Facto, I think, has a really cool idea at its core, and I love the film noir stuff. I've talked about that on the show. There are episodes of Deep Space Nine that really do the film noir stuff really well. And the older I get, and the more I expose myself to movies and stuff in the old, old American cinema, I love that genre, and I love when Star Trek gets to play in it. And Ex Post Facto really embraces those traits and those tropes, and I don't think it really works. I think it's kind of thin and not terribly interesting. I think I think I said on Twitter, I was talking, I think that I like the window dressing more than the substance. I like the film noir stuff and the concept more than I like the actual
meat potatoes of The
meat
actual
and potatoes of the episode.
Yeah.
Don't work anymore. But I think Hard Times a much more successful,
Yeah.
Substantive episode with real character development and insights and interesting stuff going on.
Big time.
Yeah. Deep Space Nine is rolling along pretty well. Episodes like Destiny, Heart of Stone. I tweeted, I think last week, that Heart of Stone is like one of those episodes that, as a kid I was kind of cool on, didn't love it all. I thought it was middle of the road at best, and now I love it. I think whenever I watch Heart of Stone, it hits me like a ton of bricks. Both the stories, I think the Odo stuff and the Nog stuff, are
both
really successful.
So
I think they work really well together. They capitalize on each other well. Fit like hand in glove. I think it's a really strong episode. It's grown on me a lot over the years. I'm always interested to find those and doing these rewatches, like seeing episodes that land differently now than I remember them years and years ago.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, you mentioned Hard Time. That was my last episode. So this week I did a 3 episodes. So I watched Shattered Mirror, The Muse, and For the Cause. The 19 and 20 Shattered Mirror and The Muse, definitely a tough go for me on both fronts. Not a big fan of either episode, but For the Cause is it's funny because these 2 episodes just feel so out of place in this such strong episode and this such strong run. So that's why maybe it feels a little bit jarring when I come to these 2 episodes. But For the Cause is, it's just great. It's capitalizing on what we've seen before. It's kind of twisty turny. It's just all great. It's all good stuff. So
yeah, lots of surprises and keeps you guessing kind of stuff For the Cause with Eddington and Cassidy Yates and all the Maquis intrigue. Really, really good stuff. Sisko doubting himself and doubting his own instincts and what could be true, what could not. I think State of Flux, the one I just watched, and For the Cause kind of go hand in hand too.
Yeah.
Like that's another kind of weird pairing of, is there a traitor in your midst and can you see it?
Yeah.
Is your bias and your feelings, blinding you to what's right in front of you? With Sisko and Chakotay and Eddington and Sisko and Cassidy and Sisko.
Yeah.
But Shattered Mirror, I think we're well on the record. We've talked a lot, I think, over the years about the pluses and minuses of the Mirror universe and how it kind of putters out in Deep Space Nine. I think Shattered Mirror kind of represents the running out of gas for a lot of people with the Mirror universe. I know I pretty much count myself in that too, and I remember talking to you about that. It's not a surprise to hear that one didn't land. And the Muse, I think, is pretty universally
might be the worst episode
cited as a
series.
major. It could, it makes lists.
Yeah.
Certainly, it's in that profit and lace kind of category. It's in fascination territory. When you see lists of which episodes of Deep Space Nine are genuinely bad or universally loathed, the Muse is never too outside of those conversations. So I'm glad you got For the Cause as a palate cleanser in there and didn't end on those 2 misfires. And I'm excited to see what you think of some of the episodes you have left in season 4. You're right at the end, and To the Death is really, really fun and exciting. Good action episode. The Quickening is controversial. That's a your mileage may vary kind of episode we've talked about on the show. I'm sure we may talk about that one again.
Yes.
And the season ends on an interesting note too. So good stuff ahead. In the chat, we have Jimmy77 and Cyber Honey, our frequent flyers and
welcome, guys.
Very valued guests. How you guys doing? Jimmy77 agreeing. Eye of the Needle was a good one.
Yes.
Cyber Honey focused mostly on TOS this week. To hone in on Kirk and Spock. Very familiar with the other first officer captain relationships.
Homework.
Love that.
Yeah.
Yep. Talking about Aaron to Mercy and City on the Edge Forever. Great episodes. Cyber Honey says she does like Lwaxana and Odo and the Muse. Interesting. Have to hear that. So I think we should transition into our kind of topic of the week with the captain first officer relationships and dynamics. We don't have a whole lot of prep done for exactly how we're going to tackle this. It's kind of just a conversation starter. We're going to talk about what we feel like and what the chat, anybody who's in here hanging out on Twitter Live and on YouTube might contribute to the conversation, might steer us in one direction or the other. But I'm definitely interested to talk about each one. I think each show is kind of
Yes.
one of the hallmarks that gives these shows their personalities and gives them their unique traits are these relationships with the people at the top of the call sheet for those series, and each one has kind of distinctive traits and unique qualities, and I'm kind of interested to see which ones come the most to mind to you, which one you kind of enjoy the most, and what you take away from each one of them. So I guess how do you want to start? Is there something right off the bat that you're interested to jump into?
I will. I think the beauty of what you just said, kind of talking about how each show kind of has a different dynamic, but there are also some similarities, and I think the similarity, at least when I first think about this, is this deep loyalty to each other. Cyber Honey mentioned
some of them develop over time.
Yeah.
Some of them are right off the bat. Some of them do develop, but that is definitely a common trait that all of them share by the time the show's rolling.
And Cyber Honey mentioned maybe a mock time in there. I don't know if she did, but that's kind of the first kind of episode she comes to mind. Kirk's ordered to go somewhere else, and he defies orders to go back to Vulcan because of the health reasons and personal reasons of his first officer. So I think that's really cool. Riker and Picard definitely have that loyalty, but yeah, that's just one of the first things, the similarities that comes to mind. We can definitely talk about the differences in each of these, but when I break it down, over time the loyalty definitely grows for each of these.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, and the differences come in how quickly or how does that loyalty evolve, and how does it manifest itself in the kind of friendship / relationship that these two characters have. They each have their own kind of different flavors. Since you mentioned Kirk and Spock, and I know Cyber Honey mentioned watching TOS this week to kind of prep to talk about this, I think Kirk and Spock represent the pure friendship of the lot. I think they have the most pure, straight up, clean cut, just admiration and friendship, the way that you would associate two people that are just friends and not coworkers or put into a position to have to work together, and then maybe a friendship evolves from that over time. I think they represent the most traditional friendship kind of bond. But there's obvious interesting meat to chew on there with the extreme yin and yang that those two people represent. I think the exploration of the two different approaches to life. TOS, we've talked a lot about either being, depending on, I guess, the episode you're watching and what point of the show you're watching it, it's about the trio kind of representing the human psyche and the emotion and the logic and having to put them together and attack a problem. Or it's sometimes it's as simple as Kirk is the humanity and the feeling, and Spock is the logic and the analytics, and having to find the answer in the middle. That's so in the bones of what TOS is, exploring that kind of dynamic through these two guys' friendship, out in space having adventures. Two people that wouldn't, on a piece of paper, two people's character traits wouldn't scream at you, oh, these two people are going to be best friends, but they can be, which I think is key. And I think you're right. I think a mock time, I think the search for Spock, even though Spock's not in it much, represent that kind of that loyalty, that friendship on display at its most pure form. Kirk willing to throw away
his career,
everything, to save his friend. It's not just a coworker. It's not just a colleague. It's this guy is important to him, and maybe more important to him than anything. So definitely a hallmark of the original series, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Cyber, he's talking about Riker and Picard's relationship. I think is a little more formal.
Yeah,
like
it is.
It's
especially at the beginning. Like he quotes
yes.
regulation and all these things, and he's really kind of by the book. So I think that's, to me, when I think of that relationship, it's more professional. I think at the end, obviously, they definitely get to that loyalty point and that friendship point. But I think initially, it's definitely really formal. I think even just the way that the first officer and captain are kind of portrayed, the position is portrayed in that show. It's more like Riker runs the crew. He's like the CEO. He deals with crew rotation and stuff with Troy, and it definitely is different, and it feels different than the TOS.
That's the HR stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's represented through, that's clearly Kirk and Picard, and there have been countless conversations comparing these two characters over the years. This is like the most common conversation in Star Trek history, comparing Kirk and Picard. But so this is not breaking any ground, but obviously Kirk is much more extroverted than Picard is. Picard is a clear introvert. He's more comfortable in his own skin. He's not the life of the party. He's not, going to make friends super easily. He's more of a stickler for protocol. He's a little more formal. His admiration and friendship with people comes out differently than Kirk's does. There's just a different kind of person there. But I don't think it's any less apparent. I think there are moments throughout The Next Generation into the movies that Picard's admiration and loyalty to Riker, and Riker's, feeling back to Picard, is clearly on display. There's a clear friendship there. But it manifests itself differently than Kirk and Spock's does.
It does.
Because of the personality of the guy at the top, with Picard just not, you're not going to typically find Picard like going on an adventure in the holodeck with Riker. I don't think. I think sometimes they hint at some things happening along those lines.
Unless it was
fencing and things like that. But I don't get the impression that there's like a lot of sheer recreational, two guys going to have a good time on shore leave together stuff going on between those two guys. But there's it's more manifested through respect and loyalty and having each other's backs and being there for each other, and having a very real friendship, but just one that looks a little different than what Picard and Spock's
and this
appears to be.
My next point, Kirk, especially with them, it's like another common thing that I notice is, if you take away the captain, will the second in command be able to, or the first officer be able to be just as successful? Like, who would you want backing you up? And I think that in all of these cases, I think they're perfect fit. But that's just another kind of common theme.
Is there? You mentioned the mock time for Kirk and Spock. Is there an episode or a moment or something along the way in The Next Generation that you think comes to mind when you think of the Picard Riker thing? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot, and watched The Next Generation super recently.
Yeah, I feel like he quotes regulation early on. Maybe it was the pilot, where the captain can't beam down. That's definitely there. Captain's Holiday, I think. Where he goes to I think it's kind of a fun Cyber Honey kind of mentioned fun playfulness. I think there's some of that in there. I think that's, I don't know, maybe those there's moments. I think when I think about it, Riker also gives up a command. I'm blanking on the ship's name that he gives up to Captain to stay with the Enterprise, but stuff like that, a couple of times. So stuff like that, moments like that, make me feel that loyalty that I felt with Kirk and Spock, for sure.
Cyber Honey mentions the Pegasus, which I didn't have in mind, but I should have, because I've watched it fairly recently, and that does put Riker's loyalty to Picard to the test, as former CO and former captain, and in a really stressful situation, having to kind of make him choose between Picard and Pressman, and his actions are gonna, his hand is forced. He has to choose one of them. and he chooses Picard. But the one that came to mind for me is the Best of Both Worlds, because of the turning down the command and kind of being thrust into command without Picard and his struggles with that. I think of that scene in Picard's Ready Room with Guinan in part 2 of that, where he's really kind of struggling with how to handle commanding the Enterprise in Picard's absence, and like does he he's got to kind of embrace the role and not try to operate in Picard's shoes or in his shadow. The size of Picard's impact on Riker's whole mentality is really on display, I think. There. And I think Jimmy 77's point about Picard didn't play poker with the crew until the end of All Good Things, I think that's the point with Picard's character. Like the journey of the Next Generation is kind of Picard's comfort level with the crew being his family, and coming to terms with kind of opening up and feeling comfortable in his own skin is paid off through that kind of moment. That's his relationship with the whole crew, but Riker's certainly part of that too. So that's another really good moment. Now the other the new stuff is its own animal, because those shows are kind of structured differently. Discovery with its rotating captain, so we're going to get to a point where those are whole different conversations. But the rest of the Berman era shows, DS9 through Enterprise, there are some common traits, I think, with all three of these captain first officer dynamics, in that they don't start from a place of immediate trust, all three of them. So you're in the midst of Deep Space Nine, and one of the things that kind of, I think, put this conversation on our radar was your kind of charting and watching the Sisko Kira thing develop over time. So as you're, where you sit now, kind of towards the back end of season 4, like what comes to mind when you think of Sisko and Kira, being knee deep into Deep Space Nine right now?
It's different because I think there's more factors that go into that, especially with the Deep Space Nine side of things. It's tough because I think Sisko is put in such a tough situation. I don't know. Does he get to pick his first officer?
No.
And so
Kira's already there when he shows up.
Yeah, I think that I feel like but that's not the case when you're a captain. I think you do get to pick.
Yeah.
Your first
under
officer.
A traditional assignment. Yeah.
So that's. I mean, it starts off with that kind of weird dynamic, and then he becomes this weird icon in her culture, and so that's kind of an interesting. It's a tough thing to kind of navigate between them two. So there's some really good stuff with that. There's also I don't know. There's a lot of great episodes. I think Progress. I think is good with them. But initially, the tough thing I think for their relationship is trust. I think a lot of these dynamics between the captain and first officer are really built on trust and things like that. And I think Kira has already struggled with trust because of what her people and what she's gone through. So Sisko coming in, it's hard to kind of build that trust. I mean, same with Sisko. Sisko's kind of in the same. He's coming off a command that he didn't really enjoy. This tough thing with his wife and things like that. So I think there's some trust stuff that they have to kind of work through. But that Progress, I think, is like the first time where I'm like, okay, like they're starting to kind of trust each other, being able to like give and take. So, yeah. I think maybe in Starship
Trust
too. There's some really good stuff.
Great.
Yeah. Sisko's injured, and but yeah, again, trust for me. That's the thing that comes to mind. It's like it's hard to build right away with their kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money. I think trust with what I think too. I think trust is definitely the sort of hallmark trait thing that is explored through these two characters in Deep Space Nine. I think, just like you said, neither one of those people, Cyber Honey mentions it too. Sisko and Kira initially didn't want the posting that they're assigned to. Like in Emissary, neither one is real happy to be there. Sisko is in a dark place with losing his wife. He's not even sure he wants to be in Starfleet anymore, and he's getting thrown to this far-flung space station in the deep reaches of space. That's like, armpit of the galaxy. Like it's just not a happy assignment at all. And Kira sees at this point in the early days of the show, there's mistrust. They just chase the Cardassians out, and they're trading one occupying entity for another one. Cardassians are gone, and here comes Starfleet. The Ploppets flag down and protect and take care of the Bajoran. So there's a process that's going to have to play out, and we get to see that process play out over the course of the early seasons and beyond, with those two characters kind of coming to terms, and Starfleet and the Bajorans kind of coming to terms. I think that's a really well explored storyline in that first season of Deep Space Nine. I think they actually chart that pretty well through a lot of those episodes, like the Bajoran and the Starfleet crews kind of mingling, and what do they do together and what don't they do together.
Yeah.
O'Brien's got like a Bajoran assistant that he's becoming friends with, but she ends up turning and doing some shenanigans. So there's a lot of stuff explored there, and Sisko and Kira are kind of like the at the top of the food chain example of that kind of playing out for us as an audience. But I think Starship Down, really putting on display like you said, the emissary role, and not just the way that complicates, I think, how Kira looks at Sisko and having to kind of like keep him, that impacts how she interacts with him. Like, not only is he her commanding officer and somebody she respects on that level, but there's this whole other
cultural icon
element.
Yeah,
there's religious implications involved, and and Sisko knows that too, so that impacts how he is with her. Like, he keeps him distant to some extent because he knows what she thinks and how she views the whole thing. So they have to work through that, and Starship Down, I think, does a really good job of putting that on display and making them kind of confront how they see each other and how they interact outside of just duty. So I think that's really cool and really well done, and it puts these two characters on a level playing field with like equal parts admiration and respect, but equal parts like discomfort at the same time, and having to work through those things. And I think that develops a strong dynamic over the course of the show. And Deep Space Nine, it's tough because there are just so many. Unlike some of these other relationships, Deep Space Nine has such a wide array of characters and different relationships that the Sisko Kira dynamic, I don't know, gets like that much more of a spotlight than any other combination
it's not
of
like
characters, because there are just so many of them.
Yeah, it's not the
1A.
Yeah, it's just one of the many different dynamics and relationships on that show. So on the one hand, it is hard to definitely nail that down, but it's definitely there, I think, for sure.
Yeah. So I think one that's really near and dear to both of our hearts, we've talked a lot about, is Janeway Chakotay and Voyager. I think there's a lot of meat there as well, to really chew on and think about. Another one that I think the common trait between these three, you kind of mentioned, in most Starfleet assignments, you get to pick your first officer, right?
Yes. Not the case.
Cisco, Janeway, and Archer, all three of them are kind of thrusted upon with, this is going to be your XO. This is going to be your second in command that you're going to have to work closely with. It's not somebody, for Janeway, it's kind of circumstance forces it, and accident, and it's less a little different than with Sisko and Archer, but all three of them don't have the benefit of having a hand-picked first officer. They pick the resume out of a pile or something. So what comes to mind when you think of the Janeway Chakotay situation, which is a loaded question because there's a lot.
There is a lot. Again, that trust kind of comes to mind right away. That's definitely a work in progress, I think, at the beginning of the show. And then it really becomes a loyalty thing at the end, I think. And some self checks too. If Chakotay goes too far, Janeway's there to say, hey, just pull the reins back a little bit. On the other side of the coin, Janeway goes too far. It's they have that respect and ability to be like, okay, let's just, here we go. I mean, we talked about Night.
Yeah.
That kind of connects these two kind of topics. So there's some good checks in that kind of episode as well. But yeah, again, there's some trust issues at the beginning, obviously, and I think by the end there's some great loyalty, but there's also maybe some romantic feelings, but also some feelings from Chakotay that he's happy and content with where the position and where they are, and so there's that dynamic in there as well. He's not in a very big hurry to make it back, so yeah, a lot of stuff, a lot of meat on the bone for that dynamic.
Yeah, I think Chakotay wants to get home, and I think he wants the crew to succeed at their mission, and isn't. I just think when challenges are brought up, and they're like I've mentioned many times before, when there's a fork in the road, he's going to be more open to the idea of settling or taking the longer road than Janeway is. There's a different attitude and a different level of obsession to accomplishing the mission of getting home. I think, and that's like I've mentioned many times, I think that's driven by a couple of different things. I think it's the caretaker of the Maquis crew, and the knowledge of what waits them back home, and I think he's conscious of characters like B'Elanna, who's like the one we know the best of the Maquis, other than Chakotay. Being as successful as she's ever been. She's chief engineer on a starship, and she's in a position that she probably wouldn't have gotten to be in otherwise. And his people are benefiting from this experience. So I think that complicates his feelings on everything. And then, like you mentioned, I think that especially in those early seasons, I think they really do lean into, or dab their toe in the water of what kind of romantic feelings are kind of bubbling underneath the surface here, with going both ways. But I think the one that is most, I think the way I always read it is that Chakotay is feeling it for Janeway, and that drives some of those decisions on his part. Where Janeway, I think, might feel the attraction and might be, in a different life and in a different set of circumstances, might be open to it, but is not going to allow herself to go down that road because of her, singular vision of this is my mission and I got to stay on track and not get bogged down by, these domesticated kind of vibes that would come from having a relationship. So I love watching, especially what I'm watching right now, these early episodes, the first couple of seasons. I really enjoy kind of charting those things that I like to look for in the early episodes of Voyager, because I think they're there. I think they were really toying with those ideas. And, I think as the show evolves, that you mentioned it, I think it becomes more about that loyalty and that checking each other. Episodes like Equinox and episodes like Scorpion, that they can have very different views on how to handle problems, and that they go toe to toe. And sometimes it's not as simple as, Chakotay was Maquis and left Starfleet, so he's going to be the roguish kind of badass, break the rules kind of guy. Sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes Janeway, because of her obsession and her singular mindset, can go harder core, and Chakotay is the one that's got to reel her back in. And I like the way that that's kind of unexpected and kind of flips the script on what you would expect those two characters to do. I think as the show evolves, it becomes more about that than the stuff that I like talking about the early seasons. With the romantic bubbling under the surface stuff. Cyber Honey says that she has a question. She wants to talk about the Picard Riker stuff. So we'll double back to that, Cyber Honey. Make sure we put it in the chat, and I'll make sure that we double back once we're getting ready to wrap it up. We'll double back to anything that's kind of left hanging. Jimmy 77 says minor nitpick. Just wish they would have taken a little more time to develop the trust between Janeway and Chakotay. Yeah, I mean that's sort of the hallmark.
Fair criticism.
Criticism of those early episodes of Voyager. I think it's a fair thing to lob at the show that that integration of the two crews maybe happens a little easily. I don't think the show was too interested in having fights in the hallways, and Parallax does that. I think the first episode past Caretaker, you have Torres and Carrie kind of fighting over the engineering job, and B'Elanna punching Carrie, and I think that actually is an episode when we kind of talked about episodes that kind of showcase these relationships, and I think Parallax is one. Chakotay pushing the B'Elanna issue with Janeway so early on is a really important thing. Resolutions, obviously, for that stuff, and Equinox and Scorpion for the other stuff, the loyalty and checking each other. So there's a lot of episodes in Voyager that I think really spotlight their relationship. But beyond Parallax, there's not a lot of like on-screen struggles.
Yeah.
A lot of it's kind of implied.
In my head canon, I can fix it. Yeah.
Right. And I think one of the things that they did with Chakotay was by having him be like a Starfleet lieutenant commander who left because he had political views on this is a Starfleet Academy graduate. This is a higher ranking officer. This is a guy with command experience.
He's got the
He's had
credentials.
important jobs.
Yeah.
Yes. This is not a fugitive guy who never graduated the academy. This isn't B'Elanna, who's not an academy graduate, who's not an officer, who's just a civilian basically, who's granted this field commission. Like this is a guy
Rios.
and I think that allows exactly. Janeway it allows Chakotay to slide into the role more cohesively, more easily, and it allows Janeway to take a leap of faith and trust that he will exercise his Starfleet training in this situation, and they've come to an agreement on it. So I hear what you're saying, Jimmy 77. I think it would have been nice to see that build over time, and I think if Star Trek Voyager was produced in 2021 instead of 1995, that would be more of a thing that was explored on screen. I think that kind of dynamic would be more attractive to a show today. The way shows are done today, but I don't know what the right decision would have been.
For me, in any kind of work setting that I work at, it always starts at the top. If the boss and that whole thing is messy, and it's just gonna trickle down through the employees. So in my mind, in my headcanon, they just begin with such a good rapport that the rest of the crew just kind of falls in line. So that's how I kind of rationalize it. But yeah, that's definitely a fair criticism.
Yeah, absolutely. Jimmy 77 actually mentions it's an episode that I don't often think of, but I think is actually kind of quietly pretty low-key good, is the Voyager conspiracy. And that kind of showcases how easily that Band-Aid can get ripped off, and those divisions can kind of come back up again. Yeah. Once people start spouting those conspiracy theories and get people suspicious of each other, those alliances kind of get tested, and I think that episode does a good job of kind of reminding the audience that this is a convenient alliance for the time, but there are some challenges to be had too. Anything else on Janeway and Chakotay?
I don't think so.
You want to touch on?
Yeah.
No. Archer and T'Pol, we've talked a lot about too. I've been on the record talking about how I think Enterprise, looks at the Vulcan human thing and the building of the Federation through the lens of Archer and T'Pol and Trip and T'Pol, and like their relationship evolving over time, and trust is the other yet again the sort of thing here, because they're not a chosen pact. Like this isn't something that was assigned. This is assigned, not chosen, and neither one of them is real happy about it at the beginning. I think this is another major trait of for this. It's a huge defining characteristic of Enterprise, is that relationship
and how it develops. Because then she gets ordered to come back, but then she wants to stay. It's one of those things where there's some good character development in that relationship as well.
Yeah, and I think Jimmy 77's point about Janeway and Chakotay kind of wishing that there was more bumps in the road and you could see the trust developing more on screen. I think that they do it with Archer and T'Pol. I think from the first season, you do see that really happen. Like it doesn't happen quickly. I think that first season kind of charts that. I think at the end of like Shockwave, when T'Pol stands up for Archer and the crew to the Vulcans at the end of that two-parter, and kind of defends their honor and that they weren't really responsible for this disaster and the Vulcans were being too hard on all that. Like that, up until that happens, there's really not an earned trust between them. They do in episodes, like when they're in crisis situations, they lean on each other, and it is slowly building to that. But until that happens at the end of Shockwave Part 2, it's really tenuous and not fully formed yet. So you do get that there. Mm-hmm. And it's one of my favorite things about Enterprise. I think it's one of the things that draws me to it is that they do that, and that it is such a slow burn relationship, and seeing how bit by bit, crisis by crisis, episode by episode, that trust gets formed over time.
Yeah.
And by the end, it's
deep trust.
It's deep. Yeah, I think it really resonates and is well earned by the end of season 4 and even into season 3. I think there are moments in season 3 in that high stress environment with the Xindi where it's really there. I think of like in Azadi Prime when Archer wants to go on the suicide mission to go bomb out the weapon.
Yeah.
And T'Pol's dealing with Trillium D stuff and her emotions are bursting. Like the thing that draws those emotions out to the point where she can't control them anymore at all is losing Archer. Archer's going to go do this thing and I don't want you to die, and stuff comes out, and I think that's really well earned over the first 3 seasons of that show to get to that point. Yeah. Archer T'Pol is closer to Sisko and Kira. I think is a good point. Having them be from 2 different cultures, 2 different organizations. They're not Starfleet. Chakotay is not Starfleet either at the time for Voyager, but he's got the Starfleet training. He's a Starfleet officer to his core, like I said, kind of like Rios. It's kind of in his blood stuff. Where Sisko, or like Kira and T'Pol are not in all caps Starfleet officers. They don't have that in their background.
Yeah.
So that is a good call.
Good call.
To kind of compare them.
Yeah.
Are there moments, episodes for you that kind of highlight that Archer T'Pol? A night and sick day, right?
That's maybe a side of their relationship that I don't want to really relive. I don't think so. The thing that kind of comes to mind is I think when they start having like dinners and things like that together, it's like that's kind of like the maybe turning point of trying to just kind of mend this relationship, because it's so I feel like in Broken Bow, Archer is so hot and so against the Vulcans interference at all. It's so cool to see that development from that, him bursting in and saying, no, let's just go, we don't want to listen until they're sharing dinner over stories and having this really kind of intimate kind of relationship. So I definitely do like that.
I think that's a case of showing not telling paying off. I think the thing that's missing from the Janeway Chakotay thing that Jimmy 77 pointed out, like I want to see this trust build. I want to see this relationship kind of actually evolve. And I think the thing that those dinner scenes do, I think sometimes people hit Enterprise a little bit for, they're always eating, all these like nothing scenes in the mess hall and things like that, and they're sitting in the captain's dining room just kind of chilling. Like, I think that's important. I think that's what does that. I think that's what allows me, speaking for myself, to buy that evolving relationship. We're seeing that these people off duty every night or every few nights sit down, have a meal together, talk about their day, talk about what's going on, talk about the crew, talk about the mission, and that's what's doing the work to build this relationship and build the trust. And not just for Archer and T'Pol, but for Trip and T'Pol, because he's often there too. It's usually the 3 of them having dinner together. And that constant returning to that, especially in those early seasons, allows us to buy that. I think that's the thing that's missing from some of these other dynamics that people wish was there. So I agree. I think those dining scenes are a major,
Payoff.
you know, interesting, uh, example of that relationship. Cyber Honey mentioned Shadows of Pajem. That's the Vulcans wanting to reassign to Paul, and Archer having to choose to want her at that point. Episodes before, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 episodes before, he'd be happy for her to get, see ya.
Reassign, yeah. Yeah.
He wants no part of her for those first handful of episodes, but by halfway through the first season, he kind of sees her value and understands that she brings a lot to the table, and it's tenuous trust, but it's building by that point. Mm-hmm. So that's a really good call. Like I mentioned, I think Azadi Prime, her emotional outburst of admiration for Archer is a major point. Her choice in The Expanse to stick with the Enterprise and go on this mission and not follow Vulcan orders and not cooperate is another major point. And I think I don't like These Are the Voyages, but seeing that last scene, "You look heroic" line, straightening his tie at the very end of the episode, I think it's touching. I think it's really well done.
That subtlety is just is so good.
Yeah, "You look very heroic" is a great moment in a really frustratingly misguided finale. It's
to put
maybe the one thing I really love.
Yeah.
The payoff of that, just the little period on the end of that relationship. Mm-hmm. So I think just kind of to briefly touch on the Discovery is really hard to talk about because we have the sort of rotating captains. We don't have a consistent. Each one has kind of its own dynamic. The first season with Saru and Lorca, and then with Saru and Pike, and then Burnham and Saru, and Tilly and Saru.
There's a lot of rotation.
Yes, there's a constant rotating door of roles. Burnham and Georgiou in the first couple episodes. So we get little tastes of these different relationships, but certainly not in the same extensive exploration that these other shows committed to, because of the formula of Star Trek up until that point was to do that. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. We don't even know who the first officer is right now. I don't think going into season 4 we know who the captain of Discovery is, but we don't have a clear handle on who Burnham's first officer is going to be. So a lot of open questions, and I think the Discovery conversation is one to have down the road once the show is kind of maybe run its course. We'll see how that all adds up. Somebody in the chat a while back did mention Captain Freeman and Commander Ransom from Lower Decks and their relationship. They're sub characters. It's hard. It's only 10 episodes, and you get little hints of them. I love both those characters, but I don't have a whole lot to say yet on that. I hope more seasons will bring more to the table. What's your favorite of the? Do you have a favorite? Do you have one that you think you gravitate to the most? Do you find the most interesting? Find the most personal connection with?
It's hard not to go Kirk and Spock just because it's so iconic. But it's tough. It's really tough. I think each has some good things in it, obviously. So, I probably would just kind of do a cop-out and say Kirk and Spock is my favorite, just because that's kind of set the mold, so to speak, and then flip the mold on its head, like we kind of talked about in the later shows. So I like to see the different, how that kind of switched. So, yeah. Did we answer Cyber Honey's question about all that?
I'm trying to figure out if her question was the... she mentions Picard is her childhood idol, mine too. And at the time, back in the old days, he was the only one that really said number one, used number one as the label for Commander Riker. So not a huge fan of Pike and Georgiou both using it in Discovery. Well,
I think that's in the Pike captain's manual.
Number one in the page.
Yeah.
It might. I think Discovery is kind of making the case that it's a more common parlance, which I think is what Cyber Honey might resist, that it was prefers to think of it more as a Picard Riker thing, something Picard does. But Pike does call his first officer number one in the cage, which is the first thing produced. So I think Pike using it in Discovery comes from that's what he calls his first officer in the cage. Georgiou using it too would imply that it's a more widespread practice to call your first officer number one.
Yeah.
And maybe the only reason Sisko and Janeway and Archer don't do it is because they didn't choose their first officers, like we've been saying. Like that's not the Picard got to pick Riker out of like he talks about looking at resumes and choosing his first officer from applicants, and that's a different kind of thing than what Sisko, Archer, and Janeway got to experience. But I appreciate that, and I too think of number one as like that's what Picard calls Riker still to this day. The Saru Burnham relationship has been building the longest. If you're going to talk Discovery, I think that's like if you're talking character dynamics, definitely that's the most well developed. I think character relationship in the show. But I think they've only been each other's captain, first officer for really a pretty short period of time.
Yeah,
having just watched the show,
they've worked together for a good bit.
A lot, right?
But not that kind of dynamic, I don't think.
Right, exactly.
I think just the trust there is more friendship based than more a maybe professional like we've seen in TG. So
yeah, having been colleagues for so long as,
but then
not captain first officer.
But there's also this distrust once Burnham gets back. So that's definitely some dynamic.
That definitely loads their relationship.
But I do think
I have a hard time,
but
not choosing Kirk and Spock too.
Yeah,
because I think if ask a random person, what do you know about Star Trek, and they're going to say Kirk and Spock.
Yeah.
So I think I have a hard time walking away from that, but I love them all for their own reasons. Like I said, I think they each bring like a defining characteristic to their shows and are kind of so baked into the personality of each show that I have a hard time choosing one over the other. But if I had to, I'd say Kirk and Spock.
Yeah, I think so. Me too. I can confidently say that. Yeah.
And I think Star Trek 09 actually, just to have a real quick aside, I think Star Trek 09 actually enhances that too. I think it's a different universe, different timeline, different set of circumstances, but I think seeing the building blocks of that friendship over the course of those movies play out, like regardless of circumstance and timeline, like these two people are kind of destined to be drawn to each other. And
that one starts off with more distrust, right?
It does,
which I really like.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Like,
but then it feels just as strong at the end. Especially with
I agree. Totally agree. So I think that'll.
Yeah.
I think that about does it.
I think that we can put a pin in this one. Let us know if you guys want to see more dynamics explored. We don't necessarily have to do characters. We can do species. We can do. This is just kind of off the top of my head, but captain dynamics with Starfleet, other things like that. So if there's a dynamic that you want to see us kind of explore, I want to say that we've kind of maybe explored more of the romantic side. So I would be more interested in seeing dynamics other than that type of stuff. But definitely let us know.
I agree.
I think there's some cool dynamics to definitely explore kind of in the future. Definitely going to try to make a conceited effort to kind of come back to this topic a little bit down the road, but this was a really fun time talking about first officers and captain dynamics.
Yeah, it was definitely like an aerial view of all of them. I think all five of the ones we kind of talked about, you could do a little bit more prep work on and do a whole hour on just those two characters' relationships. Each one of them merits its own full conversation, but we wanted to try to touch each one and talk about what we like about each as a starting point. So maybe down the road we can do that. I think certainly you could do an hour on Kirk and Spock, no problem with that. So open to all things. Right. I think April, for the rest of April, might be a little schedule. You might see maybe a pre-recorded episode to come at some point this month. We have some scheduling challenges this month.
Yes.
But we will be around in some capacity over the next few weeks. So stay tuned on the Twitter feeds for scheduling announcements, and join the Discord server. Send me a DM on Twitter, TrekFan4387, if you'd like to be a part of that and to have easy access to those announcements and schedulings as well.
Yep. Bill said it best. The discussion does not stop here. Twitter and Discord are definitely the best. With that being said, I want to thank everybody in the live chat for coming in and helping steer the conversation. Thank you for the podcast feed listeners as well. And hopefully we'll be back next week in some capacity.
Some capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.